In Michael Silberstein's absence, I am suddenly chairing this meeting, and I'd like to welcome you to the first speaker, who is Beni Pugliaro. Francesco Pugliaro, yes, who is going to talk about panpsychism and cosmopsychism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay, perfect. Thank you for coming, and it's a pleasure to start the session on panpsychism today. I'll jump right into it. The title of my talk is quite long. I couldn't find a shorter title, I apologize. Outlining a metaphysical scheme of consciousness to compose a plural universe, the case of Ruyer's panpsychism. I will come back to this title in a second. So my talk today is guided by the need to bring some clarity to a question that I could formulate like this. What do we do when we develop a panpsychist metaphysics? Or, to put it differently, is there something like a panpsychist gesture in philosophy? I tried to sketch a reply in the title of the talk. Panpsychism could be understood as the effort to outline a metaphysical scheme of consciousness that can be transposed into multiple domains: physical, biological, psychological, social, and no longer exclusively bound to the field of human existence. A scheme of consciousness that can therefore integrate and connect the plurality of the aspects of nature. Now, in order to clarify this point, I chose to focus on a specific author, Raymond Ruyer, who, at least in my opinion, is the one who pushed furthest in the elaboration of a panpsychist metaphysics, at least, of course, in 20th century French philosophy. The guiding principle of Ruyer's work is the idea that developments in the sciences of his time, and notably in physics, embryology, ethology, information theory especially, allow to provide a more rigorous foundation to a panpsychist position, according to which consciousness is the primary reality, let's say, of nature. Whatever the field of investigation, Ruyer's attention is always directed towards very specific, very strange objects that make themselves and thereby exhibit subjectivity or consciousness. This is the argument. Atoms, molecules, cells, viruses, organisms, mental events are all traversed by processes of self-formation and organization, by means of which they produce their own form, they produce their own consistency. Ruyer transposes the notion of consciousness to the various scales of these activities in a manner that is not so different from other authors such as Leibniz and Whitehead, for example. As he writes, and I put up the quote, consciousness does not need to be created distinctly because all beings are already living and conscious in the fundamental sense of these terms. All beings are forms that actively maintain themselves. In other words, consciousness shouldn't be understood as a local problem, limited to a particular domain of beings, humans, and possibly certain animals, nor is it a property added to a certain order of matter or life, but it's something that is already active within any unitary system, be it inorganic, organic, or mental. In a way that I will try to clarify in the course of the presentation, Ruyer ultimately defines consciousness as something that is in touch with all of itself from the inside, so to say, as a type of activity, essentially, that combines a form of self-affection or self-enjoyment, to use a word that he often uses in his works, combines this self-affection with a form of immediate self-production. So this is the overview of the next 20-ish minutes. Let's just jump to the first part. the analysis of physical reality. The arguments that stress a tension or an incompatibility between consciousness and physical reality usually stem from a deep-rooted prejudice, I don't know how else to put it, according to which the material world, inert, mechanical, constitutes a fundamental given, the supporting ground of all reality. Contemporary physics has shown instead that matter is a point of arrival, something whose construction can be followed, as Ruyer writes, from interactions between domains of activity. On the basis of this, physicists today don't hesitate to underline the continuity between microphysical and mental domains, as they already did 100 years ago. We can just think of Niels Bohr or Louis de Broglie. Now, and this is a crucial point, one will undoubtedly find multiple differences between consciousness and material objects, or let's say between a visual sensation and a water molecule, for example, because the world is indeed composed of a multiplicity of beings that present many types of differences, differences of composition, differences of action, differences of scale. But it's hard to see how yet another version of this argument, of this essential difference argument, could bring any meaningful light to the various facets of materiality. And especially, it's hard to see what relationship it could establish between us and the physical world other than this sort of face-to-face situation. The first question that we should ask ourselves is, what physics do we have in mind when, for example, we try to address the problem of the emergence of subjective qualities from physical processes? What idea of nature do we presuppose? The beings of microphysics are not building blocks of reality. They are not elements that are waiting to be combined into different forms, because they are themselves forms. They are themselves arrangements, fields of activities, fields of relations that are characterized by a strong non-local component, meaning that they can't be analyzed as assemblages of parts. Their elements are integrated into a unity that exceeds juxtapositions, a unity that, as Ruyer writes, enjoys a kind of ubiquity within its domain of action. All the inaugural phenomena of quantum physics in this sense affirm something like a principle of non-locality, we could say, by which the action in a domain is no longer obliged to proceed step by step. The result of this, to use an image, is that nature sort of ripples into a multiplicity of modes of bonding. On the one hand, modes of internal bonding, self-unification, self-organizations, activities of self-possession, we might say, that exceed mechanical step-by-step action. On the other hand, modes of interbonding between forms that give rise to new and more articulated individualities, molecules, cells, tissues, organs, and so forth. Now, this dematerialization of reality has given rise to some phenomenalistic interpretations that are quite current among physicists today. For example, I found this passage in a book by Anthony Aguirre, theoretical cosmologist. He writes, "We break things down into smaller and smaller pieces, but then the pieces, when examined, are not there. Just the arrangements of them are. What then are things? If things are forms of forms of forms, and if forms are order, and order is defined by us and by the universe, then those forms, it would seem, don't exist in and of themselves. They exist only as created by and in relation to us and the universe. They are, the Buddha might say, emptiness." Now, aside from the reference to Buddhism, which would require a whole digression, we find here the outline of a common interpretation of quantum theory, according to which its radical relationism amounts to an emptying of the world. We discover that things exist only in their interaction with something else, which seems to imply that everything exists only as a phenomenon, as something whose properties depend on the perspective taken by something else. In my view, at least, this phenomenalistic interpretation is probably motivated by the fact that human beings are full part of this network of relations. That is to say that human perceptions and observations don't occupy any privileged point of view in the universe, but are simply instances of interaction. The physicist Carlo Rovelli recently underlined this point in a very remarkable short paper, where he writes, mental phenomena are like other complex phenomena, and the existence of a subjective perspective is precisely the generic situation in physics, how systems appear to one another. Everything hinges here on the meaning of subjective in this sentence. The point is, are we sure that subjective means appearing? Are we sure that the fact that things affect one another means that they appear to one another? Do we have to understand this reference to subjective perspectives in the framework of human representation? By elaborating a different account of subjectivity, Ruyer advances, on the contrary, a strongly realistic interpretation of quantum physics since the 1930s. This is based on the demonstration that delocalized and self-structuring bonds are precisely what define the reality of consciousness and not just the reality of microphysical domains. I won't get any further into this, but I hope the general point is clear, that there is an argument to be made about the link between relationism in physics and panpsychism, an important argument to be made. But the problem lies in what concept of consciousness we use when making this argument. There seems to be still a strong tendency to think of consciousness as an appearance, as something almost illusory, somehow added to systems that are more real than consciousness itself, whether they are physical, biological, chemical systems. And also as an appearance in the phenomenal sense of the term, as something that implies an external point of view on the world and a series of representations of the world that are perceived by a subject. But what happens to the world when we try to integrate within it this idea of consciousness? And from my point of view, this is where Ruyer's work really comes into play, showing, first of all, the necessity of a redefinition of consciousness. As he argues, consciousness is not primarily a field of appearances or perceptions, but is essentially a mode of bonding, just like an atom, a cell, a plant, entirely focused on making itself and on organizing everything that enters into its domain of action. So moving to the second part. According to Ruyer, the field of conscious experience constitutes an example of the bonding activities at work at different scales of reality. Let's consider, for example, a visual sensation. I see a tree in front of me. The scene contains multiple details in a way distinct and exterior from one another, and yet these details exist together. They form a unitary experience. It's therefore only in a very specific sense that we can say that the visual field presents multiple details, in that, in fact, they are not its real components, endowed with a simple location and subsistence, but they are integrated into the broader unity of experience. What subsists in itself is the organization, the arrangement of the visual field. Now, with respect to this scene, there's no need to add a distinct subject that is conscious of the visual field, which sees it from an external point of view. However strong the impression might be that I am detached from my sensations and view them from the outside, so to say. Because while it makes sense to say that my eyes are at a distance from the tree, and that without this physical distance, perception would be impossible, The reference to an external perspective loses all legitimacy when we consider experience in itself. As Ruyer writes, to whom would sensations be given if not to a mythical I, an existent and useless doubling of the real I? And this is not a new argument, but if there was indeed a mental eye inspecting the sensations that arrive from the senses, we would need a fourth eye to inspect what the third eye sees, and so on and so on. And at what point of this regress can we actually say that we see something? Now, according to Ruyer, the fallacy lies here in transporting the mechanics of observation into the reality of consciousness itself. The fallacy lies in imagining the I, and I mean the pronoun, the ego of the viewer, as a sort of external point of perspective to which visual sensations are given, as in the false representation of experience in the drawing on the right. The consequence of this is that if we admit that the sensation of the tree is something like an image that is numerically distinct from the tree itself, then we have to say that this image does not need to be seen again by a subject in order to exist as a signifying image. In other words, it's a self-presenting, self-unifying form. To clarify this very particular mode of being, Ruyer introduces the concept of absolute survey. As he writes, the visual field surveys itself without positioning itself at a distance and in a perpendicular dimension. This formula, absolute survey or self-survey, is necessarily paradoxical in that it tries to thematize the capacity of a domain to unify itself, to take a total view of itself, let's say, without requiring a supplementary dimension from which to do so, unlike in the drawing of on the right that presents a simple geometrical necessity. In the case of visual experience, this implies a type of subjectless presentation. As he writes in another book, a scene painting or a heard melody are forms that present themselves. There's no need to add to me because the I exists only through their presentation or actualization. The I is just a convenient way to express the absolute of actualization. That is, sorry? Yes, to express the fact that the field of experience surveys itself. In this sense, Ruyer argues that subjectivity or the unity of the conscious field is domanial, that is, it's coextensive to the totality of the field. And by the same token, we could add that subjectivity is cosmological in that it's synonymous with the self-unification of a spatiotemporal form. We thus gain an idea of the panpsychist extension of this type of metaphysics. The capacity for self-unification and subjectivity is therefore not reserved to human consciousness. In fact, the same type of activity is found everywhere in nature. Nothing forbids us to say that material objects are the result of subjective activities at the atomic and molecular levels, because the reference to delocalized regions of space in microphysics can be seen as a way to express the same characters of absolute survey that we experience directly in the field of experience. In a similar manner, organisms and our own bodies are composed of countless subjectivities characterized by varying degrees of survey and unification, glands, muscles, hearts, brains, which oversee the operation of underlying systems and create new bonds according to ongoing needs. The brain obviously plays a central role in this discussion because it's normally regarded as the structure that's responsible for bringing consciousness, as well as memory, invention, behavior, intelligence into the world. I don't have so much time to get into it. I will just jump to the conclusion, but I can come back to this in the discussion if someone is interested. So there is much more to say, of course, but I wanted to conclude with a few remarks on the operation that is at stake here. on the general meaning of this change of scale in the concept of consciousness. What I think is especially important is that Ruyer's work allows us to frame panpsychism as a gesture of schematization. That is, as an effort to outline a minimal scheme of consciousness that can be transposed into multiple domains. An effort, therefore, of schematization and transposition. And as we saw, the scheme of consciousness that Ruyer outlines is essentially a scheme of a type of activity, a type of binding or self-structuring activity. Now, and this is the significance of this, of the panpsychist gesture, at least in my view, is that this scheme, once it is extracted from the analysis of experience, it immediately acquires a metaphysical value in that it allows us to understand not just the unity of experience, but the unity of every domain of relations, inasmuch as it unifies and produces its own form. The bet that this sort of philosophy makes is that if there is a non-trivial analogy between molecules, organisms, and conscious experience, then we have managed to find a principle that links all of these registers. John Protevi has particularly worked on this point in recent years. And this is actually, I would say, a physicist's sensibility in a way. If there is a non-trivial analogy between two phenomena, then that's not an analogy at all. It's actually the two things are instances of the same phenomenon. To conclude, we could thus say that the stakes of panpsychism lie in its capacity of world building. The function of such a metaphysics is to produce a synoptic or integrated view of the universe capable of unifying the different descriptions that are provided by the sciences. And, just one last sentence, a view that is capable of finally neutralizing the human exceptionalism that still haunts quite a lot of science and philosophy today. So thank you very much. These are the references. I can come back to it if you're interested. And yes, thank you.
I found it very interesting, but I'm not convinced. I mean, I know it's a very quick talk, but I'm not convinced from what you said that the fact that everything is in some sense self-making, that is enough for you to be able to say that everything is sort of self-presenting, which seems to be the key quality of consciousness. So it still seems to me to leave open the possibility that consciousness is a particularly intense form of self-making and self-presentation. Perhaps you can say a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a way the bet that this sort of philosophy makes is that the self-presentation of consciousness, at least of human consciousness, is of the same type as the self-unification of a unitary system, such as a cell or an organism that doesn't have a nervous system. In a way, the bet is that there is a larger concept, larger than self-unification and larger than self-presentation, that is self-reflexivity in a way. That is, self-reflexivity is the phenomenon that is ubiquitous in the universe. Not everything is self-reflexive, of course. You could argue whether this table, for example, has some sort of self-reflexivity or if it's just the molecules, the atoms. That's a whole question, of course. But the point is, and I believe it makes sense, and it's an interesting line of research, if the self-presentation of conscious experience is a type of the same type as the self-reflexiveness of these unitary systems. In a way, in order to maintain their own forms, systems like cells, for example, they require some sort of self-presentation of their own form. Of course, it's not a thematic, it's not a conscious in the human sense of these terms presentation, but it's a sort of production of a global picture or a global scheme of their form that they keep producing and maintaining. I don't know if it makes any sense.
Hi, Godard Brindrup, Munich. You used the term simple location, which is a very Whiteheadian term. And my question is, has Raymond Ruyer read Whitehead, or was he somehow influenced by him, or the other way around? I don't know. Is there any established connection? And the other question, since I haven't read him, I was not clear whether you mentioned what would be the most important book to read in which the theory you have just presented would be most clearly developed. Can you just give a reference? Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Well, to answer the first question, yes, Whitehead is actually one of the main influences of Ruyer, and I think one of the most interesting influences. In general, he's very influenced by the whole Anglo-American situation in philosophy at the time. William James, other authors in Russell, of course, Broad especially. And the notion of simple location, he explicitly takes it up and develops his own account of it. And also, I think the philosophical trajectory of Whitehead and Ruyer is quite similar. They both start in a way from accounts of natural science, physics, mathematics, and then move to a sort of philosophy of life, philosophy of the organism. And then at the end, try to develop a vision of natural theology, as well as a theory of values, etc. There are two thinkers that are quite similar, I would say. And the second question is, yes. Well, here in the references on the right, I put Ruyer's most important book that is luckily translated into English, which is called Neo-Finalism. It's been translated in English in 2016. The majority of his work, unfortunately, is only in French. There is a very important book called Paradoxes of Consciousness, Paradoxes de la Conscience, which is also a very interesting read, unfortunately not translated. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
So the next speaker is Majid Beni. His talk is entitled Dennetting Panpsychism from the Middle East Technical University, and this is pre-recorded.
Hello, I'm Majid, and if you're watching this, it means that I couldn't wake up to make it in person. So I thank the organizers of this conference for giving me the chance to present my work, which is called Dennetting Panpsychism. And this is the general structure of the talk. I'm going to introduce myself, speaking of my motive for working on, for trying to Dennett panpsychism. Then I'm speaking about one of the arguments for panpsychism, and then introduce Dennett's account of the evolution, emergence or evolution of comprehension from competence, and explain why I think it needs to be supplemented with some sort of broadly panpsychist account of consciousness or comprehension. Well, the topic of the talk, speaking of Dennetting panpsychism, may raise philosophers' eyebrows, quite a few philosophers' eyebrows in doubt, because Dennett was very clear that he doesn't think highly of panpsychism. He doesn't think that panpsychism is a fruitful research program, assuming that ascribing consciousness to all parts of the universe is not different from ascribing to them some sort of useless properties such as niftiness. But in this talk, I try to develop an enlightened version of panpsychism that is divorced from qualia-realism and built on some sort of scientific ground, or at least scientific friendly grounds for establishing its claim, more or less in the same way that Dennett himself was trying to coin qualia without eliminating it or supporting it, but providing some sort of enlightened explanation of qualia. So in this talk, I'm going to develop an account of panpsychism without making any commitment to intrinsic, ineffable subjective experiences, or assuming that consciousness is some sort of subjective intrinsic subjective experience. And in order to do that, I'm just focusing on one of the main arguments for panpsychism. There are two main arguments. One of them is the argument from continuity, assuming that there is no place to arbitrarily draw a line or even a range in a hierarchy of systems increasing in complexity, above which we can say that mind occurs and below which it doesn't. So the general insight here that has been also defended by Strawson is that in order to provide plausible explanation, we couldn't invoke brutal emergence. So the first observation is that there is no brutal emergence. Panpsychism has been also supported with another argument from intrinsic nature. But I'm trying to still clear up that argument in the context of this talk. Although I don't think there's something basically wrong with the second argument. I'm not invoking that in this talk. So panpsychists, as I say, were invoking two arguments to defend their stance. But what about science? What about the rule of science? Were they also speaking about scientific facts or scientific perspective in defense of their theory? The fact is that they didn't speak much about science, and the points in which the science had been mentioned were not immensely positive. I mean, they were mainly complaining about the quantitative methodology of the modern science that doesn't leave room for subjective experiences. And I think that a reliable version of panpsychism that has been defended by Strawson, even that tries to just find the loopholes in which science can't interact, can't speak much about subjective experience, and in this way find some sort of purchase or leverage for speaking of real subjective experiences. But the first observation of this talk is that science can't be ignored. So I try to develop a science-friendly version of panpsychism, and this is precisely in this sense that I think that version of panpsychism that I'm going to develop is in line with Dennett's account of explanation of evolution of consciousness. And I have much to say. I mean, I can speak more about by the way of criticism of panpsychists' hostile attitude toward modern science, or at least their skepticism. But I do not want to engage with that right now. We may return to this issue in Q&A. So I have already introduced panpsychism and one of the main arguments for panpsychism. I'm going to also very briefly allude to Dennett's account of explanation of consciousness, the emergence of consciousness or its evolution. So for one thing, although Dennett is defending some sort of illusionism, he's not a consciousness denier. He wrote a book to explain consciousness, so he doesn't think that consciousness does not exist. He thinks that consciousness exists, but he thinks that it can be explained in terms of, according to my understanding, he thinks that consciousness could be explained on the basis of natural mechanisms that have been evolved through evolution and that sort of scientifically explicable processes. So what we have here is a scientifically informed view on evolution of consciousness, which is informed by evolutionary psychology and cognitive sciences. And there are two main points that I'm going to mention in reviewing Dennett's account of consciousness. So the key idea here is that there are narrative selves that are embodied as the centers of the gravity, centers of gravity of our thoughts that are developed, the ability to use language, to speak about themselves and their conscious states. So, but these narrative selves belong to evolutionary agents, to natural agents that have been evolved in the natural world. And these natural agents, in order to maximize their survival, they have to be competent. So they have to have some competence in fulfilling some tasks. And the competence in fulfilling those tasks demands some sort of meaningful communication between a group of agents, and this provides a basis for comprehension. So consciousness basically evolved through this process of trying to achieve tasks, and the competence in doing the task demands some sort of communication, which is the source of the emergence or the evolution of comprehension from competence. So the main question of this talk is that, does the evolution of comprehension from competence entail some sort of brutal emergence? And the other question that we want to ponder is when the emergence is brutal, but the second question, the latter one, is more fundamental and more basic than what could be addressed in this short talk. So there are two elements in Dennett's account. On the one hand, there is a general bottom-up physicalist point of view. So consciousness has been explained from a generally physicalist perspective. And the other point is about the gradual evolution of comprehension from competence. So, which is basically formed around the idea of narrative selves and their need to communicate in order to be able to achieve their task, and the evolution of language, and then the evolution of consciousness. So the main question is that when during the evolution does comprehension emerge from or evolve out of competence? This could be very well an empirical question. And the question is, I appreciate that the question is very general. So I try to narrow down, to focus on part of a specific part of the question. And I do that by focusing on a recent paper, Welcome to Strong Illusionism, in which Dennett says we are robots made of robots who manage to create a user illusion of a conscious person, a single unified agent, a self as a center of narrative gravity. In order to precisify my former question, make it more detailed, I'm going to ask the following question. Why to assume that a conscious robot, why to assume that there is a conscious robot at the personal level, but not the level of tiny mechanism, tiny robots that make the emergence of this conscious person possible? I mean, according to Dennett's account, the user illusion of a conscious person emerges at some level of the hierarchy of robots that are contributing to form consciousness. At which level does the illusion of consciousness of a conscious person emerge? And why to assume that this illusion emerges as one specific level rather than other level, other lower levels? And I think that one way of dealing with this question is to say that an interpreter who analyzes the system could identify, individuate the level of having the illusion of consciousness. But I have my own criticism of this answer. I'm not going to delve into that criticism because we don't have time, but I'm trying to consider an advanced form of that answer. It says that there is some sort of circularity between the interpreter with some subpersonal state and the system under analysis. The system under analysis being the system of robots made of robots made of robots. And in order to deal with the circularity, we can develop a recursive account of consciousness by saying that the robots all the way down manage to produce a user illusion of person because their interaction would enable the person to use language proficiently enough to set a distinction between her own personal and subpersonal mechanism. So once more, it boils down to the issue of using language for communication as the source of the emergence of consciousness. But as soon as we delegate the issue of the emergence of consciousness, the evolution of consciousness, to the issue of the evolution of language, we have to provide some sort of theory of the meaning of language to explain at which level language becomes meaningful. In other words, if we want to explain the emergence of consciousness in terms of the emergence of the ability to communicate, the emergence of the language, we have as well tried to find a way to account for the meaningfulness of language, to say at which level symbol manipulation, simple symbol manipulation or syntactic symbol manipulation becomes language, a meaningful language that could underlie the emergence of consciousness. So in a sense, the difficult problem of consciousness would shift to the symbol grounding problem. And this is the third observation. The difficult problem of consciousness changes to symbol grounding problem, which is still, in some sense, an intractable problem. And the relationary theory of consciousness still needs to account for the emergence of linguistic cognitive comprehension as a faculty with inherently semantic properties. It needs to explain how this faculty of linguistic comprehension emerges from competence or evolves from competence. Again, I have more to say about symbol grounding problem, but we don't have enough time right now. Suffice to say that symbol grounding problem is interactable. It is not because people didn't try to provide solutions to the symbol grounding problems. Many significant people have tried that from different disciplines. And I too have tried my hand in that on a couple of occasions, but the more I think about this problem, I think that it becomes more interactable to try to account for the emergence of the meaning of the language from meaningless stuff, from meaningless symbols. So to recap, it is the use of language that enables keeping track of one's thoughts and communicating with one another, and this is the linguistic ability that underlies consciousness, the ability to have consciousness. And there's trade-off of information at all levels of the gradual evolution of consciousness, from RNA and DNA sequences to the formation of synaptic end bulbs, and up to the community of intelligent designers who speak about their shared cultural interests and are able to communicate. And this was supposed to be the venue of the emergence of consciousness, but when developing this naturalistically plausible picture, what we had to do is to try to avoid brutal emergence, because brutal emergence is still something that may mar or undermine the plausibility of the Dennettian account of the emergence of or the evolution of consciousness. Because what Dennett is trying to do is to provide some sort of evolutionary, scientific friendly account of evolution of consciousness, just devising or contriving some sort of brutal emergence in the heart of this account would undermine the naturalistic plausibility of this account. It kind of introduced some sort of explanatory gap into this naturalistic account. So it has to be avoided. And my proposal is that a good way of avoiding this kind of brutal emergence is to fall back on panpsychism. So a good way of trying to avoid this brutal emergence, even in the context of a Dennettian account of evolution of consciousness, is to assume that comprehension is entwined with comprehension from the start. So this is a very simple, even austere account of the evolution of consciousness, but it provides some sort of, as panpsychist wants it, some sort of elegant explication of the evolution of consciousness or usual illusions without invoking brutal emergence. And I think that without invoking such panpsychist accounts, the Dennettian account would have a problem with justifying the continuity of the evolution of consciousness. So it may need to put some magic trick to account for the emergence of comprehension if it doesn't assume that from the start comprehension and competence are entwined, which may involve some sort of brutal emergence that should be avoided. And in this account, consciousness, which is some sort of panpsychist trait, is not like niftiness, because it does some genuine philosophical work. It kind of guarantees or saves the explanatory plausibility of the Dennettian account. So thank you very much. As I said, I would try to be there for Q&A, but if I'm not here, please consider sending your comments and questions to my email. And I thank you very much for attending, and I thank the organizers for giving me the chance once more.
Okay, it's going to be David Longinotti, independent scholar, whose paper is entitled "The Phenomenal Imagery of Consciousness is Produced by Arrays of Qualia-Generating Neurons in the Thalamus." And he's going to be zooming in, I believe.
I'll argue for two basic claims. The first is that qualia are a type of energy generated by individual specialized neurons, and that their defensive function at the cellular level makes them self-detecting. The second claim is that the imagery we experience is produced by topographic arrays of these neurons in the thalamus, and that qualia map in a particular sensory mode is shared for percepts and thoughts. The simple model shown here will be refined and elaborated in the course of the presentation. Some 200 years ago, Johannes Müller observed that stimulating a particular sensory nerve in different ways does not change the kind of sensation that's experienced. Müller concluded that the sensation depends on the nerve itself, not on the way it's activated. Modern research supports Müller's hypothesis. In numerous experiments, the same sort of electrical stimulation applied to different sensory neurons produces different kinds of qualia. Furthermore, activation of just one fiber can cause a sensation. For example, threshold microstimulation of the visual cortex results in a single pinpoint of experiential light. Triggering the most sensitive neurons in the somatosensory cortices of macaques correlates with their abilities to discriminate tactile frequencies. From many studies of this sort, Barlow concludes that, quote, the specificity of different sensations stems from the responsiveness of different nerve fibers, and the subtlety and sensitivity of perception result from the mechanisms determining when a single cell becomes active. In other experiments, subjects were asked to rate the intensity of a phenomenal experience as a function of the neural activity induced by the stimulation. Whether the phenomenon was loudness, tooth pain, an odor, or a tactile sensation, the perceived intensity was proportional to the aggregate neural energy in the relevant tract. Based on such data, Johnson, Xiao, and Yoshioka maintain that, quote, the basic law of psychophysics is linearity between subjective experience and the neural activity on which it is based, end quote. Accordingly, it appears that qualia are an energetic property transduced from action potentials by specialized neurons. But how can a form of energy be private? And if qualia are an intrinsic property, is there a homunculus in the brain that views them? Regarding the private nature of qualia, the energy of a feeling would only be detectable by its subject if it never left its source. Analogously, we don't see the photons produced by a collapsed star because they can't escape the immense gravitational pull. Regarding qualia, the second law of thermodynamics dictates that energy must be spent to prevent an increase in entropy. I theorize that action potentials can damage some types of neurons, and these neurons avoid this harm by converting the impulses to qualia, thereby changing the threatening electrochemical energy to a more benign form. If so, qualia must be spent as and where they are generated, as compensation for the entropy their production prevents. The result is that qualia don't leave their source, so they can't be objectively observed. And because they are experienced in being detected by their source, there is no need for a homunculus. This hypothesis provides a theoretical basis for experiential displays, topographic maps of qualia neurons. This would provide a straightforward solution to the feature widening problem, the question of how the brain combines image characteristics like color and shape that are processed in different networks. These features can be registered physically on a qualia map. To discover the location and employment of the maps, I begin by reviewing some uncontentious features of the brain that have been associated with consciousness. The ultimate model of the imagery mechanism should explain these features. Sensory information is relayed through the thalamus to the cortex, where processing of it occurs. An interesting exception is the olfactory tract, which bypasses the thalamus. There are 5 nuclei in the thalamus that receive sensory inputs, plus about 50 other nuclei called higher order, whose function is not clear. All thalamic nuclei have reciprocal connections with the cortex. Both the forward and return cables linking the sensory nuclei and cortex have numerous fibers that connect corresponding points in topographic networks. Regarding the higher order connections, the descending cables from the cortex are also dense and topographic, but the ascending tracks to the cortex differ in that they are not topographic or dense. Processing of visual information occurs in the occipital cortex, beginning in an area designated as V1. This region receives retinal information relayed by the thalamus and, as I've described, sends a dense neural projection back to the thalamus. Different locations within the occipital cortex process different visual features. These networks have two-way connections with each other. Dynamically, conscious awareness of a sensory event is highly correlated with widespread synchronized gamma band activity in the brain at a frequency of 40 to 50 hertz. This neural activity includes interactions between the thalamus and cortex. Locating the qualia maps is not straightforward because brain regions are highly interconnected, and stimulation of both the thalamus and cortex can produce phenomenal experiences. However, in treating epileptics, Penfield and Jasper often removed large chunks of the cortex without any apparent effect on consciousness. In contrast, small lesions in the brainstem or thalamus can produce a coma-like state. Merker notes that infants who lack a cortex but are otherwise healthy respond to the voices and initiatives of familiars and show preferences for particular toys, videos, and songs. Additionally, in a particular case of twins joined at the cranium, the two thalami are directly connected. These sisters appear to share conscious experiences. From such evidence, it appears that the experiential maps for phenomenal imagery are in the thalamus. We experience both sensory and mental imagery, so another important question regarding the imagery mechanism is whether there are separate maps for percepts and thoughts in the same sensory mode. The evidence suggests that the same map serves both functions. Interaction between conscious thoughts and sensory qualia is common. There is sometimes interference between the two. As one says, "It was so loud, I couldn't hear myself think." Sensory priming from thoughts can also occur. Barrow was able to prime the detection of a visual stimulus by first showing it to subjects, then asking them to imagine it while testing their detection thresholds. Barrow states that, quote, "the existence of interactions between mental imagery and perception implies a common physical locus," end quote. Additionally, shared maps would be more efficient biologically. I speculate that qualia maps first evolved for sensory functions, like detection and navigation, and were later exapted for presenting memories and other types of thoughts. So how is a map shared? An important clue is that attended visual imagery seems to be comprised of discrete snapshots at a rate of 40 to 50 hertz. This is evidenced by the flicker fusion frequency, the rate above which flashing lights and movie frames seem continuous. This phenomenology is explainable if one purpose of the earlier described gamma band activity is to gate cortical pictures onto the qualia maps. If so, sensory events at a rate lower than 40 hertz will sometimes result in the same cortical picture being sent on successive snapshots. Another effect of such gating would be a reduction in the phenomenal intensity of mental imagery. If the gate opens for 1 millisecond at a rate of 40 to 50 hertz, only 4 to 5% of the energy in the cortical map would be sent to the qualia map. There is no similar mechanism for sensory inputs, so cortical gating can account for the reduced intensity of mental images as compared to percepts. Sensory and mental imagery also differ in their spatial characters. Most percepts are psychologically projected such that the imaged objects appear to be at the locations of the things they represent. Thoughts are generally not spatially projected in this way. Accordingly, it appears that another function of the gamma band impulses is to suppress the spatial projection function while cortical images are on the maps. Here's the model I showed earlier with the 40 hertz activity added. When attention detects something of interest, gamma band pulses are sent from the thalamus to selected regions of the cortex. Each pulse triggers a cortical network to send an image snapshot to the relevant qualia map in the thalamus. Each pulse also briefly suppresses the spatial projection function to prevent hallucination of the snapshot. This explains the differences in the ascending and descending non-sensory tracts. The descending cable is dense and specific because it carries cortical imagery information to the thalamus. The ascending tract is less dense and non-specific because it only transmits gating pulses from the thalamus to cortical networks. Hallucination occurs when cortical snapshots arrive at the thalamus while the projection function is active. Apparently, epileptics hallucinate because their relevant cortical neurons sometimes fire spontaneously, such that projection is not suppressed when the gated snapshots are on the qualia maps. A similar effect occurred when Penfield electrically stimulated the cortex in certain places, out of sync with projection suppressions. The posited architecture also explains why the olfactory tract does not pass through the thalamus. By themselves, odors convey no spatial information. Hence, although they can be imagined, odors can't be hallucinated, so there is no relevant projection function to be suppressed. Adding some basic cognitive functions to the model increases its explanatory power. It appears that the visual information that is displayed by the thalamus does not come directly from the retina. The information is first relayed to the cortex where processing is performed, like filling in the blind spot. The function of the dense neural tract from the visual cortex back to the thalamus is to convey the process information for experiential display. In this regard, I surmise that opponent color information provided by the retina is decoded in the cortex to determine the activation levels for primary color generators in the thalamus. Some evidence for this is an artist whose color vision was severely affected by a cortical injury. His resulting visual experiences were in muddied hues, not shades of gray. Apparently, when decoded color information is not received from the cortex, the thalamus reverts to displaying the undecoded color signals from the retina. The separation of cognitive functions from the production of phenomenal imagery explains pathologies like prosopagnosia, where faces can be seen perfectly but can't be identified. If face recognition fails, no associations or memories are triggered, so no cognitive content is produced for mental imagery. But an experiential image is still generated. Blindsight is similar in that, although partial damage to V1 can prevent cognitive processing of some portion of a visual field, sensory imagery for that region is still possible. The continuous free-flowing nature of thought was noted by William James and can be accounted for in the model. When attention is focused on mental rather than sensory imagery, a continuous loop is formed wherein the cognitive content of one experienced thought can cause another in virtually endless succession. This slide compares the neuroanatomy I described earlier to the functions and interactions posited in the model. For simplicity, the functional models I've shown have just one cortical input to the thalamus, but a mental image like a memory will generally consist of multiple sensory modes generated from information stored or developed in different cortical regions. This is represented by blocks 5 and 6 in the graphic. These inputs to the thalamus must be closely synchronized such that different sensory snapshots, like those for the visual and tactile aspects of a memory, arrive at the thalamus in the same brief gated interval. This is the reason the thalamus is centered under the cortex. This location facilitates the equalization of round-trip times for the ascending 40 Hz gating pulses and descending cortical snapshots. The structure for vision in the thalamus is the lateral geniculate nucleus, or LGN, which appears to be the qualia map for sight. Electrically stimulating the LGN causes phosphenes, so some view it as a candidate for a visual prosthesis. In binocular rivalry studies, the portion of the LGN that is active at a time correlates with what is consciously perceived at that time. The LGN nuclei for the two visual fields have the neural connectivity to receive topographic information from the retinas and the cortex. A coarse anatomical depiction of an LGN nucleus is shown on the left, with a functional representation on the right. Each nucleus has 6 retinotopically organized layers, 3 per eye. The 2 bottom layers connect to the retinal magnocellular cells, which are not color sensitive. The 4 higher layers map to the parvocellular retinal cells that generate color information. The layers are closely aligned retinotopically, which has puzzled researchers because the layers do not interact neurally. This fine alignment is explained, however, if each LGN column comprises one experiential pixel comprised of 6 subpixels, 3 from each retina. This is similar to a video display that has 3 different color-generating elements per pixel. On this hypothesis, misalignment of the subpixels would reduce the resolution of phenomenal vision. This account of the LGN explains an interesting phenomenon, a type of invisible stimulus. In a dicoptic presentation, each eye is shown a different image. When identical but color-inverted images are presented to a subject dicoptically, only a uniformly colored field is perceived, even though cortical activity indicates that the shape information is being processed. I account for this phenomenon in this slide. A particular pixel receiving input from one side of color boundary will generate red in one subpixel and green in another, because the pixel receives opposite color information from the two eyes. A pixel on the other side of the boundary will generate the same two colors, but in different subpixels. Apparently, the order of the experiential colors within a pixel makes no phenomenal difference when they are combined. So in this experiment, every pixel is perceived as having the same color. In summary, I infer from the empirical evidence that qualia have the nature to function as pixels in topographic experiential displays. They're generated by individual neurons and so can be highly localized. As a type of energy, they can be modulated in intensity, and they are detected by their source, which makes a homunculus unnecessary. Data from brain research indicates that phenomenal imagery is generated by arrays of qualia neurons in the thalamus. These maps produce phenomenal experiences from processed sensory information and from gated cortical content.
Okay, I'll throw a question then. There is a certain argument against panpsychism, which I presented the last TSC, and Ovidiu, the previous speaker, wasn't here, would have presented this evening. If you imagine the thalamus expanded so that each of your pixels, each of your qualia pixels, becomes space-like separated, then the theory of relativity kicks in and says that the sequence in which those qualia appear will depend upon the inertial reference frame of an observer. Because in relativity, there is no absolute simultaneity. So it seems that the notion that you could have a distributed array of pixels, which in the conscious mind are all unified, bound up in one moment, conflicts with the idea of the space-like separation of those pixels, which can't be simultaneous. Do you follow the argument? I'm not sure if am I on camera here? Okay. Does that make sense?
I don't know. That argument would seem to apply to anything that's spatially distributed. So I don't see how it works.
But from what I understand, within the thalamus,
nothing could be unified if it were spatially distributed. I don't know what you mean by unified either. I don't think any unification of an image as a set of, let's say, objects, perceived objects, occurs at the thalamus. That occurs cognitively.
But you're saying that within the thalamus there is an array of these pixels. Is that correct?
Right.
They're distributed in space.
Yes, just the way a video display of a computer is an array of pixels distributed in space.
But then in our experiences, we can have audio and visual at the same time.
Sure, those are different generators.
But then if the thalamus were expanded in a thought experiment to be much bigger than it is at the moment, then there wouldn't be any physically reliable simultaneity. That, let's say you hear a sound and see something at the same time,
So
whether one pixel happens before the other depends upon the position of the observer.
okay, so maybe that's why they are very close together,
Okay.
if that argument's correct.
So that will be an extra constraint on your panpsychism model that it has to be in a small space.
Right, or there would have to be some compensation to, as you say, unify the image. It's interesting that virtually all the sensory, I believe, qualia generators are in the same place, just that it eases the coordination, the synchronization of all the senses.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a question? Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So this question came up hearing that interaction, and I'm curious about perceptions outside of the spatio-temporal domain. And I think in this interplay between the sensory input of the cortex and the qualia of the thalamus, you mentioned that typically there is that loop of out to spatial projection and then back to the thalamus, but then there's that infinite loop where it goes to straight through cognition up to the cortex sensory input and then back down to qualia. And I'm wondering like if that is correlating or if that is in reference to perceptions outside of the spatio, like the temporal domain. Does that make sense?
The stuff that comes down from the cortex is the mental imagery, and it's temporal, but it's not treated spatially in the same way that sensory information is not projected, right, phenomenally.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
So I think that's one of the ways we distinguish our thoughts from our our sensations is that they're different in intensity and they're different in terms of their spatial character.
So it's the distinction between sensory objects which are projected back out into the spatial domain,
right,
and mental objects which are not, and then
right,
being in that cognition loop.
Right, except of course in hallucination, which is a pathology, right? The system gets screwed up and it starts projecting the cortical information in addition to the sensory.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Sure, thanks.
Are there any further questions? Okay, then we'll conclude. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next speaker is Vasileios Basios from the University of Brussels, Physics Department, who will be speaking on non-local deviations from randomness occurring during organizational closure. Go ahead.
Right. Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me share the screen if I can. Okay. So this is work that has been done by myself and two other friends, Francesco and Wolfram Janu, who we are part of a working group from the Galileo Commission and the ICRL. You can check the links to see what is this all about. And the grand scope of my presentation will be, first of all, as a physicist and as a scientist rather than a philosopher, why do we care about panpsychism? I would say why not? And what that has to do with organizational closure, that is structures that appear everywhere. Then we try to see what is new in the mathematical framework and how can we put this together in equations, and maybe we can predict something. And then we'll see how from that we can measure some transitions that occur when the organizational closure is going to have a rupture or is going to reorganize itself. So let's begin with the first one. Why panpsychism? For me, panpsychism is rather than a political and historical push over from cultural and societal preconditioning. It all started when Bellarmine put Bruno to stake and burned him alive for his heretical stuff. Before that, everybody would be a panpsychist in academia, but Galileo, and being the smart guy that he was, he in 603 was a condemnation of the works of Bruno to the index. Then Galileo said, "Okay, forget about this stuff. I don't want to have Bellarmine to have him running after me. So let's consider only the primary qualities, quantities, things that can be measured, can be found in the natural phenomena, and the secondary quantities, what is not measurable, soul and all that, that would be the domain of the church, and I don't want to talk about it, and I say I can save my head." So what is measurable, unmeasurable, make it measurable. That was the project that came out of this unrest. And that was the science program, well, a scientism actually, that reduce all secondary to primary phenomena. So off we go with the 4 causes of classical philosophy. Science is concerned only with material and formal cause. So the efficient cause and the final cause, things that have a meaning and telehi, that have to be delegated to the other culture, art and humanities. So then we have the triumph of the mechanistical metaphor, starting from the late Enlightenment, going through the Industrial Revolution, and now destroying every part of the planet. But it was not like that always. There were voices within the scientific mainstream taking from the roots of perennial philosophy, especially Lady Anne Conway was the connecting person and thinker with the ideas of the Pythagoreanism and Bruno with Leibniz, where later he went to Boscovich, to Maxwell and Faraday. And there we have the first idea of the field, the first kind of unobservable, non-seen thing. And it's a wonderful quote by Heinrich Hertz, the guy who discovered the electromagnetic wave, that says, these mathematical equations have an independent life of their own and an intelligence of their own, as if they were wiser than ourselves, indeed wiser than their discoverer, as they have force more than he had put into them. So this is kind of a regression to Panpsychism, even subconsciously. Another revolution that came along is this of complex systems, along the third evolution in physics, along with quantum mechanics and relativity. Here is one of the people who put forth this revolution, Ilya Begrozin. He was my teacher and mentor, and I like this picture because here he has Turing. His ideas were kind of interconnected with this of Turing about morphogenesis, and the dissipative structures is what we now understand as a system which is open to an environment, defies, of course, the second thermodynamical law, and this system can have a kind of self-organization, has pattern formations, and what later came to very shortly later came to be understood as a closure, a catalytic closure first by the great Stuart Hoffman and his co-worker Hortic. So chemicals also can kind of have a cause which is not part of their chemical reactions, an efficient cause in a sense. So then there was this great outpour of research on the organizational closure as an identity, which means closure to efficient causation. I have 2 references which bring the subject up to date, and this famous little network kind of representation of closure it has been responsible for a wealth of literature. And then we have also the intervention of Maturana and Varela, where they coined the term autopoiesis. It became a very handy term for biology, and not only. And there we see purpose in two ways: as an instrumental type, like a machine. The purpose of machine is to do a work from A to B and work with Boolean logic, but also a purpose as a self-fulfilling type. That means that a telos, an entelechy. So it requires or is subjective to self-reflection, and definitely his logic is non-Boolean. This work of Varela on non-Boolean logic is really revolutionary, and it also has been undeservedly forgotten. So why not Panpsychism then? Another Dirac metal, Andrei Linde, puts it in a classical physicist way. It is possible, he says, to introduce space of elements of consciousness and investigate the possibility that consciousness may exist by itself, even in the absence of matter, in the way that a gravitational wave is an excitation of space may exist in the absence of protons and electrons. Quite a great idea. This kind of idea is being very recently, like 1 year ago, been formulated in terms of operational probabilistic theory. The expert of that is Dariano, and Federico Fagin has proposed that panpsychism with consciousness as a fundamental feature of information and physics supervening on information. The idea here for them is to, since physics nowadays can be derived from information, as in quantum information and all that, or at least if it cannot be derived fully, it is fundamentally based on that. Why not consider the inside working of information, what a system experiences as its internal consciousness? And they try to attack the problem of hard problem of consciousness and free will in a paper that is there, but also in a chapter in a book that they have recently published. So, to cut a long story short, today when we ask why consciousness, what is consciousness and why it is there, a very practical consideration would be how and why do I raise my hand, which brings it into a contextual relational framework involving the mind's agency, what we call qualia, values, free will, etc. From all the list of the philosophies that can deal with consciousness, panpsychism, quantum consciousness, and kind of Buddhism in the sense of this cosmic field that excites consciousness everywhere, are compatible with this line of panpsychism that is emerging again in the physical sciences, which brings us to an idea close to Plotinus, where things are coming from an immaterial realm, light, become particles, atoms, by restricting themselves, by contracting themselves, appear in space and time. And then they form substance and molecules. From the molecules, we have an emergence of organizations, plants, animals, the dissipative structure and the organizational closures that we have been talking all along. And kind of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, this is the omega motion towards the omega point. So that brings all these systems under scrutiny for organizational closure and consciousness. A superorganism, the nightmare of a reductionism, is an aggregation of little beings like bees, birds, ants, that they have their own typical points and transitions from roosting to solitary hunting to self-organizing greater wholes. And by the way, this picture that you see here, it's not made up by Photoshop. This is a picture of a swarm of starlings that has awarded one of the grand prizes in photography. So it is a bird made of birds. But also in the physical sciences, we have the as I said, the dissipative structures that they appear with pattern forming abilities. very closely and explaining biological self-organized patterns. Of course, we have people as individuals, Homo sapiens species, or people as gatherings that they could say that is a kind of superorganism when they are gathering under a common sense, like here the people who perform a ceremony of remembrance, or just not being in a organizational closure where just randomly each one pursues its business. And organizational closure now is connected with crisis, metamorphosis, and emergence in these grand schemes of self-organization. So let's try to see now what is a mathematical framework, kind of an abstract representation of all these things. Could we ever incorporate consciousness and qualia in our mathematical models? It's not that we describe, it's not that this is consciousness in the sense that our mathematical models of the Earth and the Sun are not the Earth and the Sun. And we need, let's say, a quantum Leibniz or a collective quantum Leibniz. The recent developments on the field is again great Kaufman, the one that I saw you before, and Dean Radin, another great man of science, that they have put forth the question whether brain-mind interaction is quantum. And again, Ariane Fagil that I just mentioned, and Pale Kaufman, which is the wife of Stu, and she is considering feelings as fundamental feedback mechanisms that brings forth qualia and organizes them. So, and of course, we have the Penrose and Hameroff, the people who have been offering this conference ever since 1996 or so. And before, we have Jan and Dune from the Princeton University Press, also Buratinos from ICRL, Whitehead. Buratinos is following Whitehead. He's not a very well-known philosopher, but it will be known sooner or later, I hope. And then we have Wheeler, the great physicist, and another forgotten worker, student of Wigner, Harris Evan Walker, Heisenberg, much more famous, Jordan, less famous, Pauli and Max Planck, that they all consider consciousness as a fundamental reality, the real reality where physical reality appears. So what is the situation now? The situation, as in a nutshell, if we're talking about consciousness agents, we have the conscious agent, which is based in a pragmatic information, closures, beings, ants, bees, humans, that they have a purpose and they manipulate information in order to achieve this purpose. We have the syntax, grammar, and alphabet level of understanding this thing, which is the Shannon realm of Boolean logic. And then we have something that supersedes and kind of overarching this relationship of syntax, grammar, and alphabet, which is the semantics. There we can see that we have what we call qualia, the relational feelings, will, the appreciation of beauty. They are contextual, like quantum mechanic logic is quite contextual, meaningful, and in a nutshell, they constitute the values, which is an ontological principle that makes life possible. A conscious agent without values, I don't think it's a robot or a zombie. It's not at all a living being, as we know it, with purpose and will. So, and why quantum mechanical? The first who raised the question about where we make the cut was the great John Bell. He called it the shifty split. If there's an observation and the photons hit our screen, where do we register the observation? Is it on the screen? Is it between the screen and the observer? Is it in the brain of the observer, or is it somewhere beyond the brain of the observer, in a space in a state out of space and time, which has mind-like properties? And then once we have a knower and a known, already you have just by defining a knower and a known, we have an interface between the knower and the known, where in the interface, action translates to information and information translates to action. The same situation appears in psychology, but we will not go to that that time. So we have the qualities, the appetites by Leibniz, which is inside. They have a form of mathesis or gnosis, endophysics, subjective or non-spatial temporal, and the good old res cognita, and they are not observable. And then we have an interface, which one can understand as a filter, a projection, a Fourier transform with complementary variables. And then you have the quantities, which are outside, they are unfolded, they are mathematically formalizable. It has to do with the physics and all the objective spatial temporal res extensa, again, our good old res extensa, and they are observable. So maybe you can say that a qubit, the basic information unit, has another hidden aspect, which is it has to do with the meaning, the will, and the feeling or the choice of this entity. And this is exactly the approach that Fajin and Dariano take. This is the book I was telling you before that it has just been published like a month ago. And there they have four great principles about consciousness, which pretty much engulf all what we know about consciousness, that it has to do with the information experience from the inside, that is not shareable, that it is quantum-like in logic, and the state of the system is pure. That means that it has not been yet observed. And the act of observation brings information to the foreground. And the qualia there are described as ontic pure quantum states, a very handy formative if you want to write equations like in the classical quantum mechanics, and basically the informational based quantum mechanics, where though you have a transition from ontic states, something that exists, and the epistemic states, which is something that is known. And their approach also enables us to attack the combination problem, which means how many qualia can be gathered together and make another conscious entity, have an organizational closure which itself has a consciousness, a super consciousness from the qualia that this part is comprised of. So there they have a very wonderful mathematical framework for that. The juice of the matter is that organizational closure implies statistically correlated measurements and vice versa. How we can witness that? By studying these correlations in the classical, in the quantum mechanical sense of Bell-Leggett and Grag-type inequalities, or which is very easily implemented, it's the CH-SH game correlations. And in a sense, in a cartoon, we have the qubit and its qualia. This is like a quantum monad. And when many qubits are getting together, which you don't have to think about the qubits as the great computational quantum machinery qubits. Any quantum entity can qualify for a qubit if it has two states that can transform from one to another. This is the informational basis of quantum mechanics. So all these little kind of spin-like systems or two-state systems, they communicate through a non-physical space. And this is a work of Bell mainly, which is not unfamiliar to modern physics. There's a physical space cannot contain quantum correlations. I will skip that because I understand that the audience is not much concerned with the nitty-bitty of the approach of Ariano and Fajin. But the idea is that we can have qubits as observables and in relations. And for that, I am grateful for the first speaker, Francesco, who put it. He gave the term bond this is what I was searching for in order to qualify this appetite for relation. So in relation or not in relation can be bonding or not bonding, a qualia with another qualia or by itself. So we can have a minimal 2x2 model, which is very easy to manipulate. This is work in progress. And again, this is not very new in this approach. We have the quantum cognition, which has nothing to do with quantum consciousness, but it deals again with concepts as quantum states. This is for blowing up my trumpet that we have already last year had the opportunity to organize a conference in the Italian Research Council, Cenere, and the remote work, of course. And it was between interface, information, and action, where Kaufman also was there to present his great ideas. The thing is that this kind of thing, from information and action to action, that can be a nice title that will be accepted by academia. Qualia and will and correlations that they arise from mind matter, I don't think that anybody would support in having such a conference. But anyway, we try our best. The thing is that the world is changing, and again, we are all grateful for Penrose's work, that he has put forth the idea that the universe itself has a purpose and it's not here by chance. So if the universe is not here by chance and it has a purpose, that means it cannot be contained in mere three dimensions, and this purpose is somewhere outside of space and time, expressed in space and time, but nevertheless a state which is not observable in state and time. And if the universe has a purpose, then the randomness of the universe has to appear correlated when purpose is present. So the final part of the talk, I hope I'm not running too late, it's how to measure these transitions. Well, there is correlations, classical correlations, and quantum mechanical correlations, and the ones that are non-local are the quantum-like correlations. The other ones, they can have also this kind of appear as correlations, but they are not really, they are in space and time classical correlations, like the famous example of the socks of Mr. Bertman, where Bell is also discussing. We're talking about correlations that they go through a non-physical space and they manifest in physical space. And this is pretty much like Bell's shifty split. Where do you draw the line? In a nutshell, we are experiencing a moment of science that it's a retribution of the 400 years and 22 years ago abandonment of the idea that nature is animated, it has a soul of its own, a world soul or whatever. And science has to encounter subjectivity, and inevitably consciousness has to unfold further. In that way, that transforms science itself. So the novelty here is that self-releasing objectification, that means that we have to go beyond the objectifications and how we are constructing them to be able to handle them. It has to do with beyond the brain to mind-brain problems, beyond genetics to epigenetics and mind-body interactions, and beyond local interactions to the other side, the inside. So the first local manifestation of non-local consciousness have been recorded at Princeton University in the 70s by Robert Jahn and Brenda Dune, a wonderful couple that during their work at Princeton University created a lot of controversy. What they did is that they just willed a random process to go towards this or the other direction. They succeeded plenty of times. Their results have been repeatedly verified. Also, the other name that I mentioned, Dean Radin, has been very active in pursuing this kind of research with much more innovative and creative ways. The reaction of physics, mathematical engineering, mostly physics. I would say that it's like this cartoon down there. It's very impressive, dear colleague, but does it work in theory? We do not have, or we did not have a theory that could predict such phenomena. Things are changing though. Another hidden diamond of research is the work of Roger Nelson. Again, starting from Princeton University and then independently launching the project of global consciousness, where he puts random number generators everywhere. By the way, these random number generators are little diodes, quantum little qubits, so to speak, that they are running around, shielded from all kinds of environmental influences, and they're doing their job around the globe. But when things happen, they run away from randomness. They observe correlations that they are astonishingly quantifiable. The last, the cumulative research analyzed by Roger Nelson shows that it's as reliable as the detection of a particle like Higgs particle in an accelerator, 6 or 7 standard deviations away from randomness. This is remarkable. And I'm sure that more and more it will come to the forefront. Based on this idea, we have our little group of people from the ICRL and the Galileo Commission that will get together because of the Galileo Commission, because Galileo Commission is an organization that tries to expand the materialistic scope of science and go beyond what we understand now. And we have two major focuses. One is the end-of-life experiences. The greatest rupture of an organizational closure is the death of a human. And as sad as it is, it happens every day and it's unavoidable. So Peter Fennick and Vicente Araez are the doctors. Vicente is an intensive care unit doctor, and Peter Fennick is a neuropsychiatrist. And Wolfgang is an engineer who has built a new kind of device to detect these correlations. Christina Stauber and Pier Francesco also, I mentioned already. Christina is concerned with the bees, and it's a great bee scholar. So we are doing, we're trying to understand if there is a non-local deviation from the dynamics of the bees. And also there are some people who would like to remain anonymous because they would have problems with their professors. And here is a device that Wolfhard constructed, and there are two of them. There are two random number generators. So you can put, they're like Bob and Alice for the Bell inequalities. So you can put them everywhere and cover a space where things happening, like gatherings, people die, or bees are swarming, and try to understand the rupture of organizational closure. Will the regs respond in a way that they would respond to the global consciousness project? The setting is we use two of these random generators just because we need to study correlations. And because correlations cry out of explanations, as Bell himself said. If something is correlated, there must be something behind it that correlates these things. And we have, Wolfhard and other people of the group have put forth measures of correlations from the macroscopic variables. The second step would be to go deeper into the binary correlations and really study the Bell inequalities and CH-SH inequalities. But for the moment, we see amazing things, like look at this here, this is a random walk. It doesn't matter if it's random or not. look how correlated are the two together when they observe a phenomenon. They are as if there is a mirror image of one another. And we can measure this by the average z-score, the distance of the random walks, the mean distance, or the correlation, like Pearson correlation value. And you can plot things like that. The first experiments that came out from Wolf again is when people gather in a meaningful ceremony, we see correlations rising up to levels that they are not reasonable. I mean, why should these little guys that they are observing the crowd getting together and offering a prayer or meditating together, the random number correlator will burst to such a high. And while if you put the random number generators, like we call them oregano, which is organizational closure random event generator analysis. So when you put them in a control, which is like nothing happens, people going around in a lobby of the hotel, for example, there's no correlation, they're just random. And now, when I say now, it is like 2 weeks ago, we got the approval from the ethics committee of the University Hospital of Elche. Elche is a small town in Valencia, Spain, where Vicente Araez was the director of the internal care unit and intensive care unit, and now he's directing the Fundación Meta as in the Buddhist meta for compassion, because he has introduced in his clinic, in his doctors and in his nurses, also the idea that they have to be not only observers, objective observers to the people who are passing, but also to have a kind of compassionate stand for their families and their relatives and the people who take care of them. And here is the director of the project in Elche, Francisco Javier Cofes, who is a wonderful doctor in the intensive care unit, and he has also a nice video who is introducing our project to the patients, doctors, and nurses. By the way, the patients and the nurses and the doctors are very sympathetic and very emotionally engaged with this project, and which also their emotional engagement also transfers to us. It's very important. And also two great colleagues, Javier Fermin, who is a fellow physicist from Valencia, from the Polytechnic School of Valencia, and Enrique, who is a great guy in the computers. So what we do, and the ethics committee has just approved and has been launched, is to put in the intensive care unit these two little guys as observers of what's happening when people pass away, the great organizational rapture, the greatest of all, if you ask my opinion, and study the correlates with relation to the use of certain drugs, emotional state of themselves and family, terminal lucidity phenomena, that people are just wake up and say hello, a last hello before they pass, and other different end-of-life phenomena, like what Feynman observed when his wife passed away, that the clock stopped, and then he dismissed it as a good materialist, saying that that must be a chance. But many people observe this end-of-life phenomena. Peter Fenwick has done a kind of canonical or normalized pathway, and he has replaced death with this little funny cartoon, because still it's a very taboo subject to talk about this stuff. But many phenomena appear, phenomena who can be explained in space and time, and phenomena beyond space and time appear in the end of life. And also we are launching now in 1 month or two here the beehives intelligence. So we put the number random generators on the beehives, and we are waiting for their swarm cycle. Will they give a signal? Because the swarm is the death and birth of a hive. One hive becomes two. So there we are. We are going definitely towards a new science of consciousness, which have to be self-reflective, and we have to be careful of what we are observing and how we are objectifying our observations. But we have to observe three things: to keep systems and mind open. In fragmenting and abstracting nature, we should never lose sight of its oneness. And paraphrasing Einstein, what we count doesn't dictate for us what counts. What counts is really in the realm of values and meaning, expressed in numbers sometimes. So there you are. Socrates used to say, a life without self-reflection is not worth having. And paraphrasing him, Buratino says, a science of consciousness without self-reflection is not worth having. So I ask you to consider checking out the Galileo Commission, and if your merit fits with our merit, join, and let's see where we go from there. And thank you for your kind attention.